he didn't look. Good evening. We're going to open today or this afternoon with three oldies. When we all get to heaven, there's a land that is fairer than day, and when the roll is called up yonder. If you don't know these, then you have a problem. So we're going to sing the first stanza of all three. If you will stand and join us as we sing, when we all get to heaven. And now when the roll is called up yonder. Join us now as we welcome each other to our service.
As you've made your way back to We're in Genesis 16 tonight, looking at continuing the examination of the life of Abraham. And tonight, we've been digging into his life. And last time we looked at this covenant that he made, or that God made with Abram, and about the land that he would receive. And then tonight, we're going to see how Abram and Sarah take matters into their own hands concerning this heir that God has promised him. And so we're going to get started and dive right into verses 1 and 2, because this is where we see Abram and Sarah's plan that they sort of hatched, that they just sort of come up with. And so we see beginning in verse 1, it says, "Now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, 'The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her.' Abram agreed to what Sarah said." So when Abram was about 85 or 86 years old, Sarah had still not conceived a child. And you got to think, this has been 10, almost 11 years since God originally said, when they left Haran, you're going to you're going to be the father of a great nation. You're going to have a child. You're going to be a blessing to all people, and I'm going to give you a whole lot of land. And God has promised them for over 10 years now that they would have a child. And there was, as we see in this text, there was an ancient Middle Eastern tradition for wealthy women who were unable to have children. What they would do is they would use a slave or a servant as a surrogate to build their family through them. And so what would happen is the child would receive all the benefits of being a natural-born child or son of the couple, and that includes the benefits related to inheritance. And so they would, basically what would happen is the father and his wife would legally adopt the child as their own. And they would give them all of those benefits, all of those perks of being a child of that couple. So Sarah had an Egyptian slave named Hagar, and she wanted to use Hagar as a surrogate in this way for her and Abram to be able to have children. Now, I want you to notice something. One of the only things we know about Hagar is she's from where? She's from Egypt. And if she is a slave that was acquired in Egypt, pretty good chance that she was part of the dowry that Pharaoh gave to Abraham when he took Sarah into his harem. And so when you think about it, that's most likely the source of where Hagar came into this picture in their life, is that when Abram went to Egypt because of the famine, they end up acquiring Hagar as part of the gifts and the tribute that is given to them there. And she's been a part of their life for several years now. So after what we can only imagine was a long time of consideration, Sarah, as we read here, she went to Abram and suggested that Hagar be their surrogate, that she be the one that carries the child for them. And she even said, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." And so Sarah is making the case for the surrogate option, because the Lord has promised us a child, and he's not fulfilled his end, according to her at that point. And so she's like, let's do this. Let's use the surrogate option and go that route. And so Abram agreed to Sarah's plan and to the plan that they put together. And so verses 3 through 6 in Genesis 16 show us the results of that plan that they had. It says, so after Abram, beginning in verse 3, it says, so after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarah mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. So after 10 years, more than 10 years of waiting for God to fulfill this, his promise of a child to Abram and Sarah, they literally took matters into their own hands and decided that they knew what was best. They knew how to fix the problem God was not willing to fix, so to speak. And so Sarah gave Hagar to Abram, and Hagar became pregnant. And we aren't told how long it was between Sarah giving Hagar to Abram and Hagar's pregnancy. We would naturally assume that knowing the biology of child conception and stuff, that this was not a first time they're together, they have a child, that this probably was at least a few months in the works for Hagar to become pregnant. But what we do know is that once Hagar realized that she was pregnant and knew that she was pregnant, she started despising Sarah. And the Hebrew word for the way that Hagar treated Sarah means that she could have been cursing her, trifling towards her, slighting her, or even making light of her. And so you can imagine, not that we would ever see this in real life nowadays, but this Lady Hagar is probably making some catty comments towards Sarah. Well, look what I've done that you couldn't do, and maybe I should be the head wife. Maybe, things like that, that is just digging at Sarah because she couldn't have a child. And so, there's already this tremendous pain and weight that Sarah is carrying because of the infertility that she's dealing with. And now to have someone that is supposed to be helping them receive a child making comments like this, making light of her and being basically mean to her. So we can imagine that she was probably making those snide comments towards Sarah about how she did what Sarah couldn't do, or maybe she should be the one that was married to Abram and the only one married to him, or something like that. And so we see in the next verse there, though, that Sarah comes to Abram and says, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." So let me get this straight. Okay, now we had this conversation in the church office between me and Tammy for a little bit on one day this week, and then Jake came in and got in on the conversation. He didn't really help either side of this situation. But let me get this straight. Sarah comes to Abram and says, "I can't have a child, so I'm going to give you my slave, and you make her pregnant, and then we will adopt the child." And then when that happens and the slave is mean to Sarah, it's Abram's fault. Explain that logic to me again. A good husband, Rob.
Don't listen to him.
Rob said a good husband always does what his wife says. And that's what Abram did, right? Honey, I'm doing what you told me to do. Now, do what? Yes, evidently he did what? See, it's just, but no, I mean, imagine, this is their plan. Okay, now I jokingly said it's Sarah's plan, but Abram agreed to the plan. Okay, he's just as much at fault for veering from God's plan for their life as any of them. Okay, but you can imagine how difficult this situation is for Sarah, and then all of a sudden, Abram is catching the brunt of Sarah's fury because of the way Hagar is treating Sarah. And Hagar's treatment of Sarah is beyond Abram's control. I mean, I can no longer, I can no more control how Misty treats someone than Abram could control how Hagar treated someone. And so, and I'm not saying that Abram gets a pass in this situation because, like I said, he is as at fault as any of the ones in this party are. But it's just, as we were talking in the office this week, I told Tammy, I was like, explain to me how this logic works. Abram did what he was told, and now he's in trouble for it. And we had a good conversation about it. Nevertheless, and she sides with Sarah and just said that Abram's at fault. And we'll go. Yes, and he did. And he went along with the plan, even though that's not what God had said. This is the way that we're going to do this. Yep. And so Abram is at fault as much as Sarah, obviously, in this situation. But somehow, Abram is blamed for Hagar's response towards Sarah. That's what Abram is blamed for. And after Hagar becomes pregnant, she treats Sarah this way, and we see that he's blamed for that. And at that point, Abram doesn't have any real option for other than to do what he does in verse 6, and that's when he says, he tells Sarah, "Your slave is in your hands. Do with her what you think best." And so Sarah probably thought that Abram was going to defend Hagar and that he was going to protect Hagar because of the relationship that they had started to build, whatever that looked like during this surrogate process. But, Abram is actually, this is the wisest thing Abram's done in this chapter, is to say, honey, do what you want. I mean, that's what he does, and that is the wisest thing that he's decided in this chapter. And he basically gives Sarah the okay to have free reign on how she treats Hagar. And so that, we talked about the Hebrew word for how Hagar treated Sarah. Well, the Hebrew word for how Sarah treated Hagar means that she humbled her. And, when we were talking about that in the office this week a little bit, Tammy was quick to jump on and said, brought her down a notch, didn't she? Like that. And I said, she humbled her. It means that she afflicted her. She put her down, oppressed her, and humiliated her. So this wasn't just Sarah being like, you ain't going to do that anymore. Sarah brought her down several notches. I mean, she was, we would say, very rough on her, very hard on her. And not to say that Hagar is innocent, because obviously she's, complicit in a lot of things here in the way she treated Sarah. But Sarah, I think, from my personal perspective and understanding the infertility side of things because of our difficulty having children early and the pain Misty carried because of that before we had the boys, I can understand that Sarah is not just like, oh, you brought it to here, well, I'll meet you there. Sarah's like, I'm going to go up here. I'm going to make it even worse on you. And we can understand that hurt that Sarah is unfortunately unleashing on Hagar through this. And Hagar's response to Sarah's treatment of her was, natural. It was her response was what we would expect from anybody in that situation, because what she did was she ran away. It was that bad. Sarah was that vicious towards Hagar that Hagar could not stand it. She could not stay in the situation, so she ran away. Yeah, and she didn't. She didn't have, Rob said she didn't have a say in what, it wasn't like she could stand up and say, hey, you're not going to treat me this way. Her only option was either to stay and endure or to leave. And so she ran away. But that's where we read in verses 7 through 14 about what happens when she does run away. It says beginning in verse 7, it says, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarah, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord, who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Bir Lahi Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar ran away from Abram's camp, and when she does, she stopped at a spring beside the road leading to Shur. Now, Shur was believed to have been either on the western side of Egypt or on the eastern side. Bible scholars are not 100% sure where Shur was, but they knew that it was in the Egyptian region. So we know sort of the direction she was headed. Now, the last time that we know of where Abram was or located in the stories of Genesis was after he returned from rescuing Lot from the kings that we talked about a few weeks ago. He was at Hebron. But because of where this sounds like the story is taking place, we believe that Abram and Sarah were in the region of the Negev because they regularly went down to that area. That's the southern portion of Canaan or Israel. It's not a very... I don't understand what Abram liked about this place because from an agricultural perspective, it makes a whole lot more sense to be up here in Hebron and Jerusalem and in this region than it is down here. There's a whole lot more grass. There's a whole lot more, it's a more fertile area north up towards Hebron. Down in the Negev, it is like a barren wasteland that's the only way I know to put it. So God was blessing his herds and his flocks, so there must be some trick to it that I don't understand about the region, but I would think that he would stay up at Hebron. But because of where this story is happening and the way it sounds like it is playing out, chances are they were probably down here in the Negev somewhere. And you won't see this on the next map that I'm going to show you in a few minutes, but you see this faint line right through here on the topography? That's the modern day border between Israel and Egypt. I don't know why it is such a defining line, but if you were to pull up a map, you would see that line, and it actually comes down straight down to here and then comes back up around here. But nevertheless, the best guess we have for where Abram and Sarah were when this story starts to happen is right there in the Negev, somewhere in this region most likely. They'd traveled south some over the time between Lot's capture and rescue to where we're at now. But what we see is that the spring that she stops at, it says what? It's on the road, it's near the road leading to Shur. Now, if Shur is in the Egyptian region, what we find by doing a little bit more study, which we'll talk about this coming Sunday and about studying the Bible, what we find when we learn that Shur is in the Egyptian region, what we find out about Hagar is she was going home. She was running away and going home. Now, she was pregnant and all of that. She was going to have to deal with that. We don't know what her situation was when she was in Egypt and how she became a slave and all that sort of stuff. But what she was doing was she was running home. She was running away from the brutal treatment that Sarah was giving her, and she was going home. And so that was something that had never dawned on me. I'd never, studied this particular thing, and I learned that this week. I thought that was just really, it makes it more human, the story that we're talking about here, and what she did there. So when she stopped at this spring, the angel of the Lord spoke to her, and he asked her where she came from and where was she going. And her answer was one and the same. She's basically saying, I'm running away from Sarah. That's her answer. And the angel gave her some directions. Gave her directions and said, go back to your mistress and submit to her. I will increase your descendants so much that they'll be too numerous to count. You are now pregnant and you'll give birth to a son. Name him Ishmael. And she learns a little bit about what kind of man Ishmael will be and what her descendants will be like when it says that his hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. What is traditionally believed by Bible scholars is that Ishmael would be what we would claim to be the father of the Arab nations, and that Isaac, his brother, is the father of the Jewish nation, which we know because of the biblical story. Hey, Daryl, can you go back to that picture, that last picture that we had? The interesting thing that I don't know that we'll cover it in this series, but the thing that I learned in reading some of this about them was that basically from this region down in here, that is the area, and into the Arabian Peninsula, that is the region that Ishmael's family and his descendants would eventually inhabit. And so they live in that region. But think about it. The scripture says that he will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. And so that includes other brothers that we're going to talk about in a few moments, but think about the hostility that the Arab nations have towards Israel. Even today, 3,000, 4,000 years later, there are a lot of hostilities between them. And so this has been from day one. This is actually from before Ishmael is even born. He's barely been conceived, and this is already an issue that will continue to be an issue for thousands of years. So what we see is that in this moment, because of what Hagar has experienced with seeing the angel of the Lord, she gave God the name El Roi, and that's one of the names that we looked at when we looked at the names of God several years ago, when we looked at the different series, different names that are used and why God has given certain names. And the name El Roi means the God who sees, or you are the God who sees me. It depends on the translation that you want to use. But this is the name that she gives to God in this moment, but it's also part of the name of the well that she gives the name to the well, Bir Lahi Roi. And so what we do know is that as best we can tell from what archaeologists have figured out, Kadesh Barnea is right here. Now, Kadesh Barnea becomes very important in the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. So they cross the Red Sea somewhere around here. Kadesh Barnea, they make their way to there, and that's the point that Moses sends the 12 spies into the Promised Land. So they go scout out the Promised Land and come back. And Kadesh Barnea is where they begin the 40-year journey in the wilderness. And then they travel, all back and forth and around and eventually go in up here at Jericho. And so, but Kadesh Barnea was that, but it had to have been somewhere in this region. And so she leaves and hits the road that is leading back towards Shur, and she stops at this well, and that's where she has this encounter. And interestingly enough, as you see that border right there, it's about 9 miles inside the modern Egyptian border is where this place is at. It's still a spring. It's still a place where people will go and get water. And it's about 12 miles northwest of Kadesh Barnea. And so what we see, though, is that after she is at this crossroads in her life as to what she does, she goes back to Abram's camp. And so verses 15 and 16 tell us about Ishmael being born. It says, so Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. You read that. He was 86 years old when he had a child. You know what? Misty and I have a lady that we went to, a classmate of ours that just had a baby not too long ago. Her and her husband able to have a child not too long ago. And I told Misty, I was like, could you imagine starting over at our age? I was like, could you imagine? I mean, that's just, we got one going to out of high school to college in the fall. Like, and we have been done with, having kids for a long time now. But we're just like, could you imagine? Could you imagine at 86 years old starting over? Anybody pushing 86? Miss Sue, would you want to start changing diapers and staying up late every night again? I didn't say you were 86 years old. I'm just asking you a general question. Could you imagine chasing a baby around night and day? Oh my goodness. Yeah, well, you do a really good job with your great grandkids. But could you imagine not getting a break and sending them home? Oh man, you got 3 more years to think about it. You do that, Rob. But just to think about being at that age and for them to literally, they're not starting over, they're starting. Abram's starting. But that's what we see is that the end of this chapter is it ends with the birth of Abram's first son, Ishmael. And Abram, who had the final say in what the son would be named, again, makes his only second decision that is wise in this whole chapter. And what does he do? He listens to the Lord as to what the child should be named. And so he names the child Ishmael, following the direction of the angel of the Lord. Now, verse 16 gives us a reference point when we're told here that Abram's age is 86 years old at the birth of Ishmael. And so when you think about it, we can date other events based on Abram's age at Ishmael's birth, because what that means is it has been 11 years since God originally promised Abram a son when he left Haran and headed south into Canaan. Not only that, from this moment in Abram's life, it would be another 14 years until the child of promise that God has promised him, until Isaac would be born to Abraham and Sarah. And from this moment in Abraham's life, it would be more than another 51 years until Abraham would have other sons by a second wife after Sarah's death and through concubines. And so Abraham's second wife gave him 6 sons that are recorded in the scriptures, and he had an untold number of sons with his concubines. We're not told how many or how many concubines he had or anything like that. But what we see is that when we read that Ishmael is going to be against his brothers, or it's not just Isaac, that's the one we naturally jump to, but there were 6 other brothers and the concubines. And the interesting thing is that when we get to the point where Abraham dies, and that's the same chapter. He gets his second wife and then he dies. I don't know what that means, but that's what the Bible says. But he has 6 sons. What he does is he sends them all to the east. So he sends them all in that direction towards the Arabian Peninsula to get them away from Isaac so that Isaac could have free range of everything. Now, he gave them gifts, but he gave all of his inheritance to Isaac alone. And so we see that this is sort of how things play out for Abraham in this area of having children. Now, as always, we try to wrap up our study by learning the lessons that we can from Abraham's life. And in Genesis 16, we learn that God sees us in our most difficult days, and he provides us with help, which is tremendous for us. It's very important for us because, think about not just the situation here with Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, because, God was keenly aware of this situation, that what they did not surprise God. He didn't like it. It wasn't his plan, and they did what they wanted to do there. But God knew Hagar and knew her when she was born, and knew that she would still end up in this situation. He knew when Hagar was originally sold into slavery in Egypt, not sold to or given to Abraham and Sarah, but when she was sold into slavery, he knew that she would end up a slave for Sarah. And not only that, he knew when Hagar traveled back to Canaan with Abraham and Sarah that she would become Sarah's surrogate. And he watched as she ran away from Abram's encampment and was headed home to Shur or to Egypt after Sarah had mistreated her. It wasn't that God started watching Hagar as she walked through the desert towards that well, towards that spring. It wasn't that God all of a sudden, oh, there's Hagar. I've never noticed her before. You know, it wasn't anything like that. God had watched her from the moment she was conceived, but this may have been the first time, the first realization that Hagar had that God watched her and that he was intimately concerned about her. This was her aha moment, that God pays attention to me, that the God that Abraham serves, the God that Abraham worships, and the one that is speaking to Abraham, he's concerned about me. There is something about me that he is watching. He sees me, as she referred to him as. Now, whether we are experiencing our best days or worst days of life, God sees us, and he is intimately concerned about us as well. He sees us at our best. He sees us at our worst, and he still doesn't turn away from us. He still watches us. He still helps us, and instead, what we see is that when we need help, he provides what we need. And sometimes it's a well in the desert of life. And that's something that we can cling to. And other times it is the guidance on where we need to go and what we need to do. And we see that in Hagar's life, and we see that in a lot of ways we understand that God sees us in the same way. So what we can trust is that God sees us, that he's intimately concerned about us, and he'll provide us with the help that we need. And so, you know, that's the lesson that we can learn from Abram's life and from this disastrous chapter in their life for what they did. But nevertheless, there is always a lesson for us to learn from Abram's life. And so, as we always wrap up our Bible studies in Genesis, are there any questions? Any questions that I know? Go ahead, Ron. Well, I think, you know, the word I hear over here is free will, and I think that's it, because think about it. God could very easily keep all of us from sinning. I mean, if he really, I mean, because God can do anything, so why not? Why does he not take away the temptation? Why does he not, you know, make us, for lack of a better term, a bunch of robots? Well, it's because he's given us free will, and we have the free will to make those decisions. I agree with you. There's a whole lot of negative consequences that came out of this one action. Why didn't God just step in and speak to Abram like he has before and say, buddy, this is not a good idea? Why he didn't, I don't know, but I think that I tend to lean towards that God wants us to be in relationship with him, and if we are just a bunch of robots that, you know, are, you know, that don't have the free will to choose him, then, you know, it's not really a relationship. At that point, we're... Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things that I think that, you know, their situation isn't any different than, you know, our situations today, where we willingly choose to go against what God's promise to us is, or his plan is for us, and we veer off course, and you know, he wants us to pursue him. He wants us to pursue his plan, and Abraham and Sarah, they just kicked that plan to the curb and said, we're going to go over here and do things our own way. Yeah. It's all Adam and Eve's fault. Yeah, right. No, it is. Wait a minute. Sarah blamed Abram. Eve got Adam. I'm noticing a pattern here, Keith. No, I'm just picking. Right. Yeah, that's a good point. If you didn't hear Joyce, she said that had God stepped in and kept Abraham and Sarah from going down this path with Hagar, then we would not have the lesson that we learned from Abraham's life here, that God sees us, that he's, you know, intimately concerned about us and stuff. That's a good observation, Joyce. Definitely. You know, that's the thing that we see is in that moment that God doesn't just kick Abram to the curb because he's messed up, because he's sinned and been like, well, I'm done with you. You disobeyed me this time, and I had a better plan, and God can, as you said, make a masterpiece out of our mistakes for sure. Any other questions or comments? Yes. Well, evidently they would have had to have, but let me do some research on what word is used there in the Hebrew, because Hagar is never mentioned again as a wife of his. It may be I don't know. Let me look and see, because the Hebrew word that is used there could maybe give us some idea of what is meant there, because I did not catch that, Dennis, until I was reading it in front of y'all tonight, and I was like, oh no, I don't have an answer for this one. So I'm guessing that the Hebrew word may be able to give us some indication. So I'll look at that this week, and so thank you for asking that one. Don't. Now, wait a minute. Remember, we're not fussing at Abram on this. This is, 60-40, it's Sarah's fault. Remember? No, I'm just picking. I'm just picking. Go ahead. Basically, yeah, the Arabian, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I thought the same thing. And what Keith's saying is that, when you look at the descendants of Ishmael, that's where the Muslims come in. And, the hatred they have for the Jews and one thing and another. And that it's amazing to see that God was able to use all of that even thousands of years ago to bring them to the point they are now, plus what will be fulfilled in end times through what we read in the book of Revelation. Yeah, definitely. He wants that relationship with us, and if we don't choose, it's not a relationship. It's being forced on us, just like Sarah was forced to be a slave. Gave her, okay. So it said gave her his what? Gave her the maid. Well, I wonder if maid is just another term for servant or slave that they might be using there, but I don't know. I'll look it up in the Hebrew and see what we can learn from that and see um, about that. Any other questions? Y'all had some great ones. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, yeah. And he did, and I think he used that sort of like Steve said a minute ago, it, sort of between him and Keith, that God used it to orchestrate what he needs to occur down the road, even though he knew through his all-knowing ability, he knew that was what they were going to do. For sure, I think that's a good observation. It didn't catch him by surprise, just like Hagar running away didn't catch him by surprise, or any of that. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Yes. If you couldn't hear Sheila, she was saying that isn't that what we see in the Bible over and over? Is that our way really doesn't work, and we need to really follow God's way, and it is. That's the we see that repeatedly. King David, King Solomon. Yet when we don't wait on him or we don't follow his plan, or we end up messing things up, and we really need to follow his plan and be patient, and that's not easy for us. We won't, we're human. We want it, and we want it now, and we've waited 86 years, 85 years. Why don't we just have the child this way, and then we'll have, our child? And it messed up things from there. So, any other questions? Good ones this evening. Well, I don't think she liked him too much, because eventually, we'll read when Isaac is old enough to be weaned. He's probably in their day, he would have been between 3 and 5 years old. Isaac it's like they have this big celebration for his weaning, and because of this, during this time, Ishmael actually does something that raises the ire of Sarah. And Sarah's like, "You're getting rid of them, Abraham. They're leaving now." And from what I remember of the story and what I've studied in the past, I believe that what ends up happening is that Isaac is made fun of by Ishmael. Put this in perspective. Ishmael is roughly, golly, he would have been almost 20. He'd been a little older than my oldest son. And here Isaac is, he's a 5-year-old probably. And here, Isaac is getting made fun of, and Sarah, being the queen, she's like, get rid of him. And so that's, I don't think that they had a good relationship. I think Abraham probably had a good relationship with him, because it was his son, and he was, trying to do what was right by him. But I think that it was probably I don't think that it was even, hospitable towards each other, if I had to guess. But that was basically where it's at. Any other questions? That was a good one. Any other questions? All right. Well, we will be next Sunday night. We will be in chapter 17, which will be where God institutes with Abraham the covenant of circumcision. And so we'll read about that next time. And next Sunday night, Wednesday night, we'll be in our study of the early church. And so be here at 7. We'll go through our study of the early church. And then next Sunday morning, we'll be continuing in our series on digging into the Word. And we're going to look beyond just reading the Word like we were talking about this morning, but we're going to look at what it means for us to study the Word and really study the Scriptures. And so I hope that you'll be here for that. And so with all of that being shared, I'm going to ask Darrell, if he would, to close us with a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed.
Dear Lord, and thank you for bringing us together to study your word tonight, and thank you for reminding us that your way is always the best way, and our way is usually not.